His great splayed hoof-prints told Danny that there was something wrong with his right foreleg. "Mebbe he's hurt hisself, or else he's gettin' rheumatism like old Danny," Danny whispered to himself, holding the .44 ready, cautiously edging forward. Then the tracks veered abruptly east, keeping easterly, always in or near cover. The tracks were getting fresher. Danny saw where the deer had stopped and relieved himself. Then he had moved on, starting to climb the foothills of the Mulligan Range. He had stopped to paw and nuzzle some moss. The tracks were getting fresher. Whew! Old rocking chair blew. Danny had the rifle up, peering ahead. There was the sound of heavy running, a swishing in the thick spruce cover, and then there was silence. Nothing but the tall spruces, bent and clotted with their mounds of snow. Nothing but the brooding, whispering stillness, the vast hush of winter. Old rocking chair ran less than a quarter of a mile. His bad leg was obviously bothering him. Danny could see that he was favoring it. His fresh tracks kept climbing out of the spruces into the thin birches and maples. "Where the hell is he waltzin' me?" Danny muttered. "Up the goddamn mountain?" There was no mistake. Up, up led the tracks. Up a narrow valley, then another, and yet another, twisting and turning for cover, toiling up, always up. First rocking chair would stop and blow. Then old Danny would have to do likewise. It had become an endurance contest between the two old campaigners. In all the years they had lived at Hungry Hollow, neither Danny nor the boys had ever actually climbed the Mulligan Mountains. To be sure, they were always going to. Next summer, mebbe. This fall for sure. And now Danny was really climbing them, lugging the heavy old .44, hot on the trail of fabulous old rocking chair himself. The great deer and Danny toiled up and around and up for nearly an hour. Whew! Danny blew as he gained the top and rested, leaning the .44 against one of the towering Norway pines which fringed the crest. He mopped his forehead with the sleeve of his wool jumper. Then he fished in the game bag of his jumper and brought out a pint bottle of his own moonshine. "Here's to you, old rockin' chair," he whispered, draining half of it in one splendidly sustained trumpet solo on the bottle. He turned and looked down and across the vast sweep of the Big Dead Valley. The waning sun was a dull clot of red in the southwest. The distant Mulligan and Big Dead rivers made occasionally visible ribbons of quicksilver in the broad carpet of solid forest. Danny stood staring down at the silent spectacle. "Come on, Danny, old man, don't stand here mooning over the scenery like a bloody tourist. Let's get after this goddamn deer," he petulantly complained to himself, grabbing up the .44. Old rocking chair had rested less than 100 yards from him. His limp was much worse. He was tiring rapidly. Danny put several more cartridges in the .44 and adjusted the rear sight for a short shot. He eagerly pressed forward. It wouldn't be long now. The wavering tracks took Danny through a thin fringe of gnarled, wind-blown scrub pine. Then abruptly the pine opened onto a broad plateau on top of the mountain. "My God!" Danny exclaimed, lowering his rifle and looking in awe at the sight before him. A great forest of full-grown white pine had once stood on the mountain top. All of them had been uprooted, mowed down in some violent, far-off catastrophe. The giant trunks jumbled and crossed like mighty matchsticks, mostly lying east, while the great gnarled roots lay west, reaching witch-fingered into the air, beseeching and rigid in the final agony of death. The scene was invested with a sense of nameless and infinite ruin. Danny stood staring at this mute evidence of a tail-lashing, angry nature. "My God," he repeated, "old Ferguson'd turn over in his grave." In the center of this vast graveyard was an open space, a shallow swale devoid of cover save for a solitary, low-branched spruce which grew in the center. The dying sun glittered over the scene as Danny stood muttering to himself, "Well, I'll be—" It was old Rocking Chair coming out from behind the bole of a fallen pine from the side of the swale at Danny's right. Slowly he moved out into the open swale, sleepily blinking his soft velvet eyes, limping painfully as he trudged toward the protection of the spreading spruce in the center of the broad swale. Danny sighted him in the .44 and gently pulled back the hammer. The great antlers shone in the sun. No longer was the splendid head held erect as always before. It was bent nearly to the ground, as though the sheer weight of the proud antlers had finally grown too great a burden to bear. Danny sadly followed old Rocking Chair through the rifle sights. It was a short, easy shot. He could see the gray hairs on the thick, powerful neck and broad withers as the aged buck headed for the lone spruce. Should he let him have it now? No, he'd better wait and let him get nearly to the spruce, so that if by some miracle he did miss him on the first shot, he'd at least get another shot in before the deer reached cover. Old Rocking Chair gained the spruce. "Now!" Danny breathed. "When he comes out from the other side of that there spruce, I'll let him have it." He knelt in the snow on one knee, squinting along the .44. A minute passed, 2 minutes. Danny lowered his rifle. "Now don't tell me that sleepy old codger has gone and bunked down right there." Danny twisted and craned, trying to look under the spruce, but it was set too low in the swale. He raised the rifle, carefully sighted, and waited once again. Still the deer did not appear. Danny glanced over his shoulder at the sun. It had disappeared, and dusk was rapidly falling. He stood up. He'd have to hurry to bleed him and dress him out and hang him up before dark. Yep, I guess I'll have to go in and root him out. I never assassinated a goddamn sleeping deer yet so far. He cautiously worked forward, the rifle held ready, hammer back, alert to fire whichever way the animal bolted. 5 feet, another 10 feet, another 20 feet. Danny kept edging toward the spruce, and still no old Rocking Chair. 10, 20 feet more. Danny was at the spruce. He edged rapidly around the left side of the spruce, tense and ready, the rifle sighted. Well, I'm a goddamn side-hill gouger. There, limping painfully over the edge of the swale some 40 yards away, was Old Rocking Chair. He had sensed Danny's presence when he had got out into the swale, but had given no sign, knowing he was beyond retreat. The wily old buck had made a right-angle turn when he had got behind the tree, and had made a bee-line for his escape, keeping the spreading spruce squarely between him and his tormentor. Danny quickly fell to one knee, and again sighted along the 44. It was still a comparatively easy shot. "But I gotta shoot him through the rear valve," he whispered, grimacing and shaking his head. He lowered the rifle, then raised it again. Suddenly he lowered the hammer to safety, and stood up, chuckling, flinging the rifle from him into the snow. "Not by a goddamn sight!" he shouted. "Hey, Rocking Chair, look! Here's Bumps!" Old Rocking Chair turned in the fading afterglow, his large eyes luminous and liquid. Danny whipped out his pint bottle and stood there gurgling until he had drained the last drop. "So long, Rocking Chair!" he shouted, flinging the empty bottle after his rifle. "Good luck, old boy. See you next fall, I hope." Old Rocking Chair blew, proudly tossing his great head as he turned, and hobbled painfully over the ridge and out of sight. Number 20. The Midnight Ride of Heinrich Werther. Under the magic therapy of Swan's cooking and Danny's moonshine, Buller soon became his old self again. His lips gradually resumed their moist rosebud pout. He slowly took up the slack in his old dray clothes. He even got so that he could refer to his misadventures of the past summer without too many grimaces of pain. Then at the dinner table on Thanksgiving Day, as though to celebrate the completeness of his recovery, Buller gave the boys their first blow-by-blow account of the saga of his new suit, from its glorious inception in little Japhet's tailor shop to its final incineration in Chuck Woodlock's burning shack. Danny and the boys, at once sympathetic and curiously embarrassed by Buller's confession, listened with rapt attention, occasionally darting quick glances at each other over the mounds of venison, rabbit, and partridge bones piled high on the long Thanksgiving table. "There," Buller concluded, reaching for a bit of partridge breast that had so far miraculously escaped his attention. "That's why, in the future and from now on, I'm laying off that Japhet Moylanen in particular, and all tailors in general. There's nothing but a bunch of grasping robbers." He sighed. "If only I just hadn't seen that beautiful piece of cloth in his goddamn window," he regretfully concluded. Old Danny had sat in brooding silence during Buller's recital, meditatively raising vast clouds of peerless smoke from his corncob pipe. Now he spoke up. "Listen, Buller," he said quietly, "talking about tailors, did you ever hear tell the story of the little old German tailor way back in the White Pine days, what really got his comeuppance?" "No," Buller breathed, swiftly rising to the fly. "Let's have it. Tell us the story about the little old German tailor what really got his." Danny said, glancing doubtfully at the camp clock, craftily sparring for advance royalties on his story. "I ain't sure as if I'll have time. You see, damned if today ain't my turn to wash the goddamn dishes." He tugged at the slack on his neck and gazed thoughtfully at Buller. "But I'll tell you what," he generously conceded, I'll tell this here story about the little old German tailor if you'll take my turn washing all these Thanksgiving dishes." He spread his hands out benevolently over the littered table. "Old Danny don't feel up to doing both, so take your pick. Buller, no dishes. Danny, no story." Poor Buller writhed in his dilemma, but found himself more concerned with learning the plight of the little German tailor than in relieving his own. All right, you tell the story, and I'll do the bloody dishes," he pouted. "But it sure better be good. As for you, you should ought to have been a tailor yourself, you conniving old goat." "His name was Heine Werther," Danny hastily began, before Buller could change his mind. "He was a chubby little old fella. He looked like an assistant Santa Claus what landed in Chippewa from Germany long before I did. He was awful nearsighted, too, and wore square silver specs as thick as opera glasses. And talk about a German accent. He had an accent as thick as a man what swallowed a big chunk of salt pork. Ach! For a long time he was a high-class tailor with a big shop near what's now Big Annie's on Pearl Street. On Sundays he'd drive to church with his team of prancing bays, pulling a fine big rubber-tired Studebaker carriage. I remember his carriage had silk tassels, too. Well, sir, for years he made oodles of money tailoring all the fancy suits and coats for the mining crowd and all the big lumbermen, but he had one weakness." Danny paused and lit his pipe. Yep, he sadly shook his head. "The poor little fella had one bad weakness." "What's that?" Buller asked, innocently eager to learn of one chink in the moral armor of any tailor that breathed. "He drank," Danny declared, glaring at Buller. "All his troubles, like others I could name, came straight from strong drink." Buller sought to hide his confusion over this shaft by hastily spooning up a few crumbs of partridge dressing. Danny composed his ruffled dignity and went on with his story. "By and by, little Heine's drinking got so bad that all his swell customers started to commence leaving him. They discovered the suits he was making 'em was getting either too big or too small. His customers all begun looking like they was aiming to win first prize at a masquerade. Naturally, they up and quit him, so old Heine finally got down to just making plain blue serge suits for the miners and lumberjacks and folks like us. It seems that the likes of them weren't so particular about the fit." "And did he up and die in the poorhouse?" Buller charitably inquired. "Not exactly," Danny said. "But old Heine finally lost his Studebaker carriage and his team of prancing bays to old Demon Rum. At last he took to driving around to all the lumber camps in winter, mooching meals and taking orders for blue serge suits. He traveled in a little red sled pulled by a big yellow dog." Danny lingered over the memory of the big yellow dog. Yep, that there mongrel dog of his was big enough to skid logs with. I remember like it was yesterday. His name was called Bismarck." Danny, always a keen student of semantics, appealed to Buller's sense of linguistic fitness. "Now, ain't that a hell of a funny name for a big yellow dog?" "Forget the goddamn dog. What about the drunken tailor?" Buller petulantly demanded. "Heine and Bismarck could travel from camp to camp, like I says, showing samples and measuring up the lumberjacks for their blue serge suits. His terms was $5 down and the balance upon delivery of the suit when the spring drive was over." "Well, what happened to this little nearsighted tailor?" Buller doggedly persisted. "Then the very winter before I went to work for old Ferguson, 'twas right where we're living now, old Heine come on his rounds with his dog Bismarck, and, would you believe it, measured up 47 suits for spring delivery at this one camp alone, at $5 a head. When the lumberjacks come to town that spring, they all piled straight over to Heine's place to get their new suits before they started blowing their money on whiskey and women. When they stomped into Heine's place in their caulked boots, I give you one guess what shape they found their little old tailor in. Dead? Buller hopefully ventured. Dead drunk, more like, Danny glibly rolled on. And nary hide nor hair of a blue serge suit, or even a sample, or so much as a yellow tape measure to be found in the whole bloody shop. The place was just clanking with empty whiskey bottles, and there was little old Heine wallowing and snoring in the midst of 'em. Yep. The boys at Ferguson's camp alone lost, let's see, 5 4s is 20, over 200 and some odd dollars. My, if it wasn't that old Ferguson himself happened to be along with them, holding stakes for the balance on the suits, them jacks was so mad they'd like to have up and kilt little Heine. Danny clucked his tongue over the memory of Heine's close shave. You don't mean they let him get away with it? Buller demanded. Not so fast, chum, Danny warned. Just keep your britches on. Now let's see, where was I at? Oh, yes. The next winter, old Heine and his big yellow dog arrived at camp as usual for to take the new suit orders for the following spring. I was working for Ferguson by then. It was just before the big storm what snowed us in. Say, did I ever tell you boys about that there big blizzard? Not today, yet, Buller replied with infinite sarcasm. But Danny, with the problem of the Thanksgiving dishes neatly out of the way, refused to be ruffled. Little Heine and Bismarck arrived just around supper time, he continued placidly. It was kind of odd the way he allus managed to hit all the camps just at meal times. Anyway, Paddy Belden, the barn boss, unhitched Heine's big yellow dog and stabled him in with the horses, whilst Heine took his pack-sack of suit samples and order books and tramped up to the bunkhouse just in the nick of time for supper. The cook was just banging his triangle. They didn't feed the rascal, did they? Buller wanted to know. Sumptuously, Danny replied. Yes, they all at supper, and after supper they goes over to the bunkhouse and commences their usual card games and dancing and singing to the accordion, all the while ignoring poor little Heine and his samples. Then Heine up and promised faithful he'd apply their old $5 from the winter before as down payments on their new suits. But the boys kept right on ignoring him. Heine then played his trump card. With tears misting his specs, he reaches in his pack-sack and drug out 6 quarts of old cordwood, full quarts, mind, and sets 'em on the long bunkhouse table. Buller was incredulous. You mean he just up and give you boys all that whiskey? Yep. Drink it up, boys, is all Heine said in that Katzenjammer lingo of his. Then Red Murray, God bless him, ran out to the cook's shanty for to fetch me and the cook, and inside an hour every mother's son of us was toasting little Heine and ordering suits like we was one of them rich old country dukes setting out on a world tour. The cook ordered a high silk hat. Red Murray even ordered a fine opera cloak with red silk lining. Damn fools, Buller muttered. Little Heine was hopping around like a hen on a hot griddle, measuring suits and marking down orders and drinking and singing German songs and measuring and drinking and marking. And pretty soon all of us was half shot, what with that being the first whiskey we'd tasted in months and the heat from the big bunkhouse stove and all. Lucky for Heine and us that old Ferguson was in town, busy with his own drinking, or he'd have skinned us alive. All the lumber camps in them days had strict rules agin drinking. Thinks I, we need such a rule today in this camp. Anyway, pretty soon Paddy Belden come up from the barn and takes out his silver watch and says it's near midnight and time for bed. What then? Buller asked, scowling and hitching forward in his chair. It was plain that the little tailor had not yet suffered appropriate enough tortures to please him. Little Heine asked Paddy would he first please hitch up his yellow dog Bismarck to his red sled for him. "Pois Heine's little drunk," he said. So Paddy give us the wink private, and we knew something was up. Paddy had a few quick drinks and ordered a couple of 3 suits and said, "Heine, your big yellow dog is down in the barn all hitched up and ready to go." Pointed straight up the sleigh hall toward Chippewa. "Dank you," Heine said, smiling sleepy-like and taking another big hooker of old cordwood. Then we floored the rest of Heine's whiskey, and Paddy and Red and me and pretty near all the rest of the jacks waltzed Heine down from the bunkhouse to the barn to see him off to town. All but the cook, who never could hold his liquor anyway, and who stood outside in his underwear, hammering and banging away at his triangle. It was a fine, clear night, near to 0, and the full moon on the snow was gleaming blue all over everything. It was kind of dark in the barn, and Heine was commencing to wobble pretty bad, so we helped put him and his samples in his sleigh and tucked the robe around him, whilst Paddy stood at the dog's head so he wouldn't bolt. "Ach, mein dog Bismarck, it is well you don't drink too," Heine said. "Whoa there, Bismarck, whoa," Paddy kept repeating, winking at us. And those what could still see, not includin' nearsighted Heine, for the first time saw that it weren't no big yellow dog hitched up to Heine's sled. No, sir, it weren't no dog at all. Danny paused, and with aggravating slowness filled, tamped, and relit his pipe. Buller could stand the suspense no longer. "My God, man," he shouted, "what was it then hitched up to the goddamn sled?" "Why, Paddy's pet deer, a young spike buck called Prancer, what'd been hanging around the camp ever since he was just a little spotted fawn. Yep, Prancer'd never been put to harness before, and he was bucking and plunging something awful." "A goddamn deer?" Buller whispered, awe-struck. "A goddamn deer," Danny solemnly answered. "What happened then?" Buller said, wiping his brow. "Gute Nacht, mein Freund," little Heine said, waving his fur mitten and commencing to sing a new German song. "Good night, Heine," the boys said. "Good luck on your trip home to Chippewa." "Then what happened?" Buller breathed, leaning forward tensely. "Then Red Murray quick thrun open the barn doors, and Paddy give Prancer a smart whack over the rump. 'They're off,' Red Murray hollered, and away dashed Prancer and Heine in his red sled up the icy sleigh hall in the moonlight. Yep, that was the fastest goddamn ride what any tailor ever got up to that there very night." "And then what?" Buller muttered. "Us jacks stood down by the barn and cheered Prancer and little Heine on. In the meantime, the cook kept pounding away at his triangle. In nothing flat, Prancer was up to the first curve, near a quarter-mile away, but instead of taking the curve like he should ought to have, he kept going straight, plunging clear over the high snowbank in one leap, slick and clean, sled and all, dumping off little old Heine ass over tin cups. And so help me, scattering samples and orders for blue serge suits and opera cloaks halfway across Township 49. Yep, that little old drunken tailor sure must have thought he'd been hitched to Halley's Comet that night. Yep. Danny glanced at the camp alarm clock and turned to Buller, yawning elaborately. "Well, there's your tailor story, chum, like I promised. Me, I'm taking a snooze." He gestured at the littered dinner table. Now how about being real quiet, Buller, when you wash up all them dirty dishes?" Buller sat purple with glee, convulsed with gales of silent mirth, shaking his head, slapping his thigh, turning and appealing wordlessly to the others. "Boy, oh boy, what a whale of a story," he managed to gasp. "Oh me, oh my. Whatever happened to little old Heine? Did he hightail straight back for Germany?" "Well, sir," Danny said, "we naturally had to rescue him and bed him down with us for the night. Elsewise he'd have froze stiff. The next morning we went out on snowshoes and finally found his sled and harness, minus the deer. Paddy rescued his big yellow dog where he'd hid him in the oat bin, and once again we waved the little tailor off for Chippewa." "Did he make home that time?" Buller asked. "'Twas the last time we ever laid eyes on little old Heine or his big yellow dog, or even our pet deer Prancer, for that bloody matter." Little Timmy suddenly got up from the dinner table and hurried across the room and stood sulking by the window, frowning darkly. "What's eatin' you, Timmy?" Danny demanded. "It ain't your turn to do the goddamn dishes, is it? Or did you run clean out of them damn crossword puzzles?" Timmy wheeled on Danny, shouting hotly, "I think it was a damn shame the way you big bullies treated that little old drunken tailor. I just wished I'd have been there. It was a damn dirty shame." Outraged, Timmy stood glowering at old Dan. Danny was remarkably reasonable. "P'raps it was, Timmy," he admitted. "P'raps it was. I 'spect it's all in your point of view. Now, if a man of your fine intentions and high character'd been there, you'd 'a saved Heine all right, and Heine'd have just went on being a little drunken old tailor. That's how all you reformers and snoopers manage to save folks. But under our special lumberjack treatment, what do you think really happened? Heine got so damn scared that first of all he up and quit drinking just like that." Danny snapped his fingers. "And then he sold his big yellow dog, and in a few months he was back making dress suits and fancy togs again for the big loggers and mining crowd, even employing 7 young German tailors." Danny sniffed virtuously and reached for his pipe. "Yes, sir, we really deserved a gold medal for saving him from the demon rum. And would you believe it, when he died, as we all must, and this I have on the best authority, in 3 days little Heine was busy up yonder making opera cloaks exclusive for St. Peter hisself." Danny rolled his eyes up to heaven. Yep, Timmy, it's as true as I'm settin' here." Number 21, From Old Nick to Saint Nick. It was the week before Christmas. In the Chippewa City Hall, the young mayor and city council were sitting in extraordinary session, wrestling with a grave problem. Here it was past mid-December, and they had not yet found a Santa Claus. What to do? Every year at Christmas, Santa Claus paid a visit to Chippewa. During these annual visits, Santa made his headquarters at the fire hall. On the afternoon before Christmas, he would ride in state to the municipal Christmas tree on the big red fire truck. There he would distribute oranges, popcorn balls, and candy to the delighted children, receive their wishful little letters, and even kiss those children that insisted upon final beatification. Unfortunately, just the Saturday night before, Sly Santa had paid a premature visit to town. Traveling incognito, he had wandered into Charlie's place. During the subsequent enthusiasm of the evening, waggish Santa had mistaken the entrance to Charlie's steep basement stairs for that to the latrine. He was presently languishing in the Chippewa hospital, still incognito, and with a broken leg suspended from a unique series of pulleys. There were those who darkly hinted that Santa had been hitting the bottle. but they were the incorrigible town cynics and Yuletide agnostics. They were vastly outnumbered. At any rate, this year there was as yet no Santa Claus available for the visit to the Christmas tree. "How about you, Ole?" In desperation, the harried young mayor appealed to Councilman Sodergren. "Dat ver good joke," Big Ole guffawed, slapping his knee. "Did Mr. Mayor ever hear a Santa say Merry Christmas with a Swedish accent?" "I guess you're right, Ole," His Honor gloomily agreed, staring out the window down Main Street. Suddenly he turned to the assembled councilman. "Who's that?" he exclaimed. "Who's that big fat fellow walking into Charlie's place with Danny McGinnis?" "Why, that's Buller Bodine," the city clerk said. "Everybody knows Buller." "Why, you don't mean—" "Why not?" the mayor began to say. Councilman Sodergren leapt to his feet. "I make a motion that Mr. Mayor be authorized to employ Mr. Buller for Santa, not to exceed $50, moved Councilman Sodergren. "Me, I second the motion," quickly agreed Councilman Luigi Purgatorio. The motion carried unanimously. The assembly sighed with relief and swiftly adjourned. "I'll make it 35 then," the mayor said to Buller, placing another $10 bill on the green cloth-covered poker table in Charlie's back room. Perspiring Buller stared hard at the money, then shut his eyes tightly to blot out the alluring vision, puckering out his lips and extravagantly wagging his head like a petulant child. 40 then, the mayor said grimly, adding a crinkly $5 bill. "No." "Ouch!" Buller glared at Danny, who was threshing his legs around under the table. "Listen, Your Honor," Buller went on, glancing quickly at the bills on the table. "I've done a lot of queer things in my day for money, but I ain't never yet took up with deceiving little kids. Surely for all that dough you should ought to be able to get the genuine product down from the North Pole." 50, the mayor said doggedly, tossing out a crisp new bill. "That's the very limit. Take it or leave it." Buller mopped his brow and stole a look at Danny. Danny was sitting back staring up at the ceiling, trying hard to pull out one of his mustaches by the roots. A storm was brewing. Buller gulped. I'll take it," he said, reaching out for the money, only to find that Danny was there first. Danny carefully counted and folded the bills, and daintily extracting a wrinkled 5-spot, tossed it over to Buller, sinking the rest away in his buckskin wallet. Danny patted the wallet. "That there's on account," he said to Buller. "There's many a slip 'tween here and the municipal Christmas tree." "There's only one thing more," the mayor said to Buller. "I don't mean to infer anything, but we'd like it if Mr. McGinnis here came in with you to the fire hall on the morning of the 24th. The young mayor was obviously embarrassed to suggest even remotely that Buller might go and get drunk. "What I mean is, just to be a sort of chaperone-like. Is it a deal?" Buller and Danny and His Honor arose and solemnly shook hands across Charlie's poker table. The pact was made. There was no backing out now. "Charlie!" Danny shouted at the top of his lungs. "What's that?" Charlie shouted back. "Fetch back 3 Boilermakers on the double." "Yes, sirree, Mr. Danny," Charlie shouted. "Coming up like a yiffy." On the morning of December 24th, a morose Buller, along with Danny and the boys, rode into Chippewa in Matty's big sleigh. They put the horses in Burke's livery stable and resolutely marched past a dozen saloons, getting to Mrs. Smedberg's hotel for breakfast. After breakfast, Danny locked his arm in Buller's and firmly towed him out the door toward the fire hall. "Meet you in Charlie's after the doin's," Buller's jailer called over his shoulder to Matty and the boys. At the fire hall, Danny casually drew Assistant Fire Chief Tug Cooney to one side. "Listen, Tug," he whispered, "where's a safe, dry place we can lock that buzzard Buller till it's time to wrestle him into his uniform? We want to make sure he don't step on his Santa Claus whiskers during the big doin's." Tug got the point. He winked elaborately at Danny. Sure, and even Buller can't get drunk on stoker coal. Leave it to me. I'll keep him sober." Tug drew Buller aside and whispered to him confidentially, "If you'd mind to wet your whistle a wee bit before you put on them hot whiskers. Just you slip down to the boiler room there when old Danny ain't looking." Tug winked at Buller. "You'll find the bottle hid behind the steam gauge on the furnace, that you will." Buller nervously wet his pursed lips like a trumpet player making his debut at Carnegie Hall. He winked back at Tug and earnestly gripped his hand. "Thanks, Tug," he said. "You're a real pal." Tug slyly suggested a cribbage game to while away the time. After all, the ceremonies didn't start till 2, and Buller needn't start changing until 1. Buller found himself rather restless, and no thanks, he didn't want to play. So Danny and Tug and Fireman Skinner McKittrick and Sliver Anderson cut for partners and were soon deep in their 15-2s and 15-4s. Buller sidled over to the boiler room door, blithely whistling Jingle Bells to show his Yuletide resignation and vast unconcern. But Danny didn't even look up. Stalking Buller studied a fly-blown advertisement of fire hose which was tacked on the boiler room door. He stood back and nodded appraisingly. "Damn nice hose." Glancing back at Danny, he gently opened the door and ever so gently tiptoed down the stairs, closing the door softly behind him. How in hell could a man go in for this Santa Claus stuff on a dry battery? "There," said Tug, winking at Danny and triumphantly turning the key in the lock after Buller. "That'll hold old Saint Nick till we're after playing our game. Whose dale is it now?" Oddly enough, trapped Buller seemed quite content to sulk alone down in the boiler room. There was no mad bellowing or railing or wild lunging at the door. Buller was completely beaten. The cribbage game ran on and on. "And 8 is 12 and out," Danny said, just as the clock in the fire hall tower boomed 1. Tug unlocked the boiler room door. "Okay, it is now, Buller. It's time for you to be getting on your fake whiskers," he called down into the basement. There was a hollow echo, but no reply. Tug looked wonderingly at Danny. "Oh, my God," Danny moaned, frantically clattering down the boiler room stairs. Buller was stretched out on his back in front of the furnace with the cement floor for a pillow, his plump right hand clasping an empty quart bottle of old cordwood. The heat from the furnace had done the rest. Tug vainly tried to shake and roll Buller awake, but Buller just oscillated to and fro, slowly coming back to rest like a huge, soft, gyroscopic toy. Skinner McKittrick hurriedly tiptoed over and looked behind the large, dusty face of the steam gauge. "I knowed it," he mumbled ruefully, biting his lip. "I just knowed it would happen to me." "Fireman McKittrick," Tug said sternly, pointing accusingly at his subordinate, "was you the laverick what planted that there quart of whiskey behind that steam gauge?" Fireman McKittrick hung his head and explored the cement floor with his toe, peeking up at Tug from under his troubled brows. "I'll tend to you later, you pantry-drinking knave." Tug turned to Danny. "This leprechaun of a Skinner's gone and found the hiding-place I used to use before I became assistant chief. Honest, Danny, I didn't know there was a bottle hid down there. By all the saints I didn't, that I did not." Buller began to snore. "Oh, the Lord save us," Tug moaned. "'Tis 20 after 1, and we got no Santa Claus at all.